there are a number of problems with GDP. Now, I would say that they tend to break down into two categories. One would be logistical problems with how GDP is calculated. In other words, does it include the things that it's supposed to? Is it missing some stuff? Is it getting it wrong? So that would be one category, would be what I would call maybe logistical or practical considerations. The other issue, or the other issues, are going to be issues with using GDP as a measure of well-being. So as I pointed out in the last video, GDP was actually never meant to be a measure of well-being. It was and is a measure of production. It's the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a year. And there's not necessarily any reason to think that that's going to track with well-being. It might be relevant for well-being, but it's similar to income. And I think most of us understand that income is not necessarily the primary piece in determining our well-being. So if we list these out, we can talk about it misses the underground or unofficial economy. It misses non-market production, which is about 50% of economic activity. Maybe we'll back up here to misses the underground or unofficial economy. So if we were to compare the GDP of Montana versus the GDP of Colorado, and let's say that the market value of final goods and services produced in each state are identical, right? We are still going to have Colorado GDP show up higher than Montana GDP. Why? Well, marijuana is legal in that state. In other words, that's the underground economy. It's the illegal economy. It's going to show up there in Colorado's GDP, but it's not going to show up in Montana GDP. Misses the unofficial economy. Now, so underground is typically anything that's illegal, and unofficial, other countries oftentimes have a very large unofficial economy. In other words, people aren't in the formal system. They're not filing 1099s. They are largely in the cash-based economy. They don't report to anybody, and so if that isn't carefully measured, it's going to be missed in GDP. So that's one thing. Now, again, is that a practical or conceptual? Is that a practical problem with how GDP is measured, or an issue with using GDP as a measure of well-being? I would argue that that is a practical consideration. Right? We know that there is a market value for, right, a sexual encounter in Billings. Is that counted in GDP? Almost certainly not. Is there trade of money for sexual favors? Probably, right? And is there a market value? Yes. You and I may not share, right? We might think that that's socially destructive, or we might not. But the key is there is a market value, just like there's a market value for cigarettes and there's a market value for tomatoes, right? And that would not be included. Now, practically, there's some countries like England that said, we're going to include these underground transactions in our GDP calculations. And the problem there becomes they're estimating them, and they're estimating them based on what, and it might not be a bad idea, but it also may end up creating a lot of problems. In other words, how do you know that this is the market value versus this other thing? So that's one issue with GDP, and that is a practical, not a conceptual issue. GDP also misses the value of non-market production. As you just saw, about 50% of economic activity, although more in poor countries, tends to be non-market production. This would be, are you helping a friend move? When you help a friend move, or when you cook a friend dinner, or when you cook a loved one dinner, that would be non-market production. Now, when I was growing up as a kid, my mother stayed at home to take care of my sisters and myself. Turns out she and my neighbor could have dramatically increased American GDP. My mom could have sent us kids over to the neighbor, and the neighbor could have sent her kids over to my mother. My mother could have taken care of the neighbor's kids, and the neighbor could have taken care of us, and they could have each paid each other $100 million, and American GDP would have gone up by $200 million. It's obviously a somewhat ridiculous example, but that is what we're dealing with. There's a lot of non-market production. One of the things here is that will introduce biases across time. More recent GDP, right? It will favor more recent GDP. If you think about what's happened in this country in the last 100 years, increasingly, non-market production has been turned into market production. That's a large part of where that growth in the services sector in the economy comes from, right? Instead of my having a spouse one of us stays at home and cooks and cleans, I will eat out a lot more, thus that being counted in market production. I bought a robot vacuum cleaner that runs around my apartment. I hire somebody to come in and clean my apartment. I send my shirts out to be laundered. All of these are things that could have been and historically were captured in non-market production that have been shifted into market production. So we should understand that there will be bias in favor of more recent GDP. And there's also biases across nations. Poor countries tend to have more non-market production. So that's just something to be aware of. GDP misses the value of leisure. Now, incidentally, non-market production, missing the value of non-market production, is that a conceptual or practical issue? I would argue that's probably more of a conceptual issue, or an issue with using GDP as the only measure of well-being, because there isn't a market value. There wasn't a market value of my mother taking care of us kids. We could have figured out what her lost wages were and how much she was trying to give up, and we could try and impute that. But again, what was the market value? There isn't a market value. So should have that been included in GDP? No. However, is that something that we would care about if we're trying to get a sense of well-being? Absolutely. Same thing with leisure. We get some value out of leisure, about not having to go to work, not being obligated to do certain things, to be able to take a vacation. Of course, with this recent quarantine, our sense of that may well change. Who knows? It'll be interesting to see how our perceptions at the end of this look. But the key here is that GDP is going to miss the value of leisure. It was never designed to capture this, and so it shouldn't be surprised that it's not in there. Again, I would say this is a conceptual issue with GDP, not a practical issue. In other words, should GDP include leisure? No. Now, to be fair, GDP will include some parts of leisure. So again, if I were to go to Disney World, which is obviously not possible at this point, but maybe I go to Galaxy's Edge to go to the Star Wars portion of Disney World, now that Disney owns the Star Wars franchise. The tickets into Disney World and the t-shirts and the lightsaber and the food that I buy at Galaxy's Edge will be counted in GDP, right? That's going to be part of consumption. But the value I get out of being able to take a break and etc., that will not. Now, say I go camping. I get on my motorcycle and I go camping. The gas that I consume along the way, and any hotel rooms that I stay in, and any fees at campgrounds or national parks or state parks, those will be counted in GDP. However, the enjoyment I get out of nature and that would be another one here. That actually would be part of the bads and goods. So there are amenity values. Oftentimes we talk about environmental things. So a beautiful view. When I go visit my folks over in Belgrade, from all sides of their house, they have these big windows, and you can see the bridges, and it's gorgeous. And out one window you can see a creek and some trees. It's beautiful, right? The house itself and the construction of the house and some of these other things was counted in GDP when the house was built. They're still getting value out of this. So we should understand, as I mentioned earlier, that GDP is inherently going to be an underestimate. One way to think about this is that GDP is a flow variable, whereas well-being is probably closer to a stock variable. So this would, if you want to think about flow variables versus stock variables, one of the ways to think about this, or at least the way I think about it, is on the ranch, we had stock tanks. We had windmills with stock tanks where the windmill would pump water out of the ground and it would flow into the stock tank, basically the water tank that cattle could water at. The amount of water coming out of the spout was a flow variable. The amount of water in the tank was a stock variable. Arguably, what you care about probably the most is the amount of water in the tank, not the amount of water coming out of the spout, although the two are related. So GDP is a flow variable. It is not a stock variable. And so by that account, we should expect that GDP is an underestimate of well-being. So that's another piece. So misses bads and goods. What's the market value of a view of the Bridgers? There really isn't one. There's a market value of a hotel with a view down in Bridger Canyon, but there's not really a market value for a view of the Bridgers. So that again would be a conceptual issue with GDP, not a practical issue with GDP. Again, this is not meant to be a definitive list, but this is definitely a list. GDP also misses income distribution. As I said, GDP per capita, which is what we're generally looking at, GDP per capita is an average. We take the total market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a year. Again, there might be some issues with whether we included the underground and unofficial economy, but we take that and we divide by the population. That doesn't tell us that people are getting that. It is entirely possible that one person gets almost all of it and everybody else has to share the rest. Well, if we were to hold GDP per capita constant and go from a less equal to a more equal income distribution, I think most of us would understand that that's probably a good thing. Again, there might be some relationship between income distribution and GDP per capita, but that's something we can set aside for now. Again, I'd say this would be an argument for triangulating, right? So we could, on the value of leisure, we could look at how much leisure time people get. On the bads and the goods, we could look at environmental quality. We could look at amenities. Income distribution, we could look at something called the Gini coefficient, which tells us how evenly income is distributed. So again, I would argue with these last three particularly, we should understand that we would want to triangulate. And those would be problems with using GDP as the only measure of well-being. Now I'm going to make another point here, or at least add another one here, which is that GDP misses the value of international trade. I will email out and attach to Teams here an exercise, a homework puzzle for Monday on, for Friday. I'm losing track. Regardless, this will be, because these lectures are going up tomorrow morning, which is Wednesday. They are relevant for Friday, so this will be homework that will be due on Friday. Woohoo! See, I just kept track of the days. That was a huge accomplishment. So, an exercise in why GDP misses the value of international trade. Again, not a definitive list. The book talks more about this. Here's some illustrations of things why we might care about this. Here we have the average work week in the United States. So GDP per capita in the United States is higher than GDP per capita in the United Kingdom. However, the average work week is a fair bit longer in the United States than it is in the United Kingdom. On the other hand, so by that margin, once we triangulate, GDP per capita probably overestimates well-being, the difference in well-being between the United States and the United Kingdom. On the other hand, we have China, where the work week is much longer and GDP per capita is much lower. And so there we could reasonably, if we triangulate, conclude that GDP per capita on its own almost certainly, would that be, understates, yes. GDP, the gap in GDP per capita between the United States and China would be understating the difference in well-being. Again, that's something that I have to think carefully about. Same thing here. GDP per capita in the United States is much higher than, not much higher, but somewhat higher than Germany and the Netherlands. Of course, Germany and the Netherlands have shorter work weeks, and so the difference in GDP per capita is reasonably an overstatement of the gap in well-being. So again, just saying we can triangulate here. Here's a nice example of different ways in which we could have GDP per capita distributed. So any of you Beatles fans out there hopefully have recognized what's going on here. We have year one, and then we have 3 different scenarios for year 2. So what we have seen between year 1 and year 2 is a 10% growth in GDP and GDP per capita. We went from 100 to 110, from 25 per capita to 27.5. So situations A, B, and C all have seen the same growth in GDP per capita and the same growth rate in GDP. And we go, yay, that's a 10% growth rate. That's huge. That means we would double in 7 years. That's pretty impressive. And it is. Now, at that rate, however, we look at the differences. Year A, John has gone. Now, we started out with some fairly unequal income distribution, but basically they have all shared equally or in percentage terms the same. On the other hand, B, situation B, all of the gain has gone to Ringo, and situation C, all of the gain has gone to John. So very different situations, right? We could probably, if we wanted to talk about an equity standpoint from the point of view of the band, assuming John is contributing equally to the others, we could reasonably say that situation C is a more equitable, right? That's probably an improvement in well-being compared to situation B. But in all 3 of them, you have exactly the same growth rate in GDP per capita and GDP. This isn't saying, again, I don't think this is a problem, a practical problem with GDP. I think this is a conceptual problem with using GDP as the only measure of well-being. And as I mentioned, there are other measures of income inequality. The most common is the Gini coefficient. All right. So I would argue that GDP is a useful piece of information, but we should be aware of the shortcomings of the measure, right? Using it as the only measure of well-being is going to be problematic. We should understand it's a flow variable, not a stock variable. We should understand that it's missing a bunch of things. We should understand that it's practically also just really difficult to calculate. We should also understand that it is more reliable the further back we go in time. GDP was designed for a purpose, and that purpose was never assessing well-being. Really, the purpose, the whole point of GDP was pessimistically, it was to justify American involvement in World War II. More optimistically, it was to assess economic activity or production, not well-being. And so we shouldn't be surprised that if you use it as the only measure or the main measure of well-being, we might end up missing some important things. GDP, again, sometimes as we showed with the infant mortality in the Hans Rosling video about just generally mortality, GDP does, however, even if you don't care about GDP, it does tend to go along with things that we do care about. So it may be a proxy. Again, I would argue we should probably work to triangulate. Now, to be fair, when I showed you the data on growth, I just showed you data on GDP per capita. And so there is this beautiful tension within economics. I don't think it's actually very beautiful, but we say, economists will acknowledge that GDP is not a great measure of well-being, and GDP per capita is not a great measure of well-being, and we should certainly triangulate. And yet, what we will see in the news and the discussion that is going on now about how long we should keep the country on lockdown or whether we should go on lockdown, one of the things that is coming up there is what will happen to GDP, right? What will happen to the economy? And not the economy in terms of social coordination and cooperation, but the economy as measured by GDP. And again, this is going to be an easy tendency to go ahead and measure and use the data that we have available to us, whether it makes sense to use it and whether it's good for the purpose that we're using it for or not. A side note that I think is interesting, I haven't read there's a biography of one of the longest serving governors in Hong Kong. For a long period of time, he refused for GDP, for the government statisticians to calculate GDP. And it wasn't that he didn't think it was interesting or useful, but when asked why he refused to let people calculate GDP, he said, because as soon as it's calculated, people are going to use it for policy-making decisions. And it will become the primary measure of well-being, and that, he decided, would be destructive for Hong Kong. Was he right? Interesting question. I don't know, but it is something to be aware of, that GDP has a lot of shortcomings, and the people who use GDP, I hope that most of them who use GDP understand the shortcomings, but even when people understand the shortcomings, it is very easy to skip the triangulation and simply start using GDP as the primary measure of well-being.